Classic fairy tales are often told to children to impart a lasting lesson or emotional response. Sleeping Beauty, Three Little Pigs, and Red Riding Hood are all historical literature about the good guys winning, with the girl marrying a prince or evil being thwarted, and everyone living happily ever after, at least according to the Disney version of those tales. There are other versions of these stories from throughout the ages, told to update the narrative to reach wider and newer audiences in a process called remediation. Stories are a sign of the time they are written, and often these stories become irrelevant or out of touch. Video game narratives are often remediated versions of these classic stories and tales, being one of the newer, current mediums used to portray them in unique ways. However, that difference in time when the stories are told can change many things about them. The moral focus may shift to match the current sensibilities, or the style can shift to change the focus entirely away from being a cautionary tale like its ancestors. The Wolf Among Us is a great example of these things. The Wolf Among Us is a video game based on Bill Willingham's graphic novel Fables, making it not only a remediation of old tales, but also a remediation of recently written narratives. It shows that remediation is not limited to retelling an old story as something separate and new, as it is set in the same universe as Fables, and set before the first issue, but is also set chronologically after all the classic fairy tales have happened. By putting all these old familiar characters together, Telltale Games could tell new stories, without also having to explain the origins of every one of these characters, and also turning the remediation on its head by engaging the audience who are now assuming things about the characters they know. Fairy tales have not always been the dramatic romanticized stories portrayed by Disney. They originally held a much different intent. The origins of many fairy tales are derived from the cautionary tales of folklore. For a lot of people, the Disney rendition of popular fairy tales are the original, or at least the only variant of the story they've heard. Disney often remediated tales first recorded by the Grimm's brothers. The Grimm's works are in fact remediations of existing stories, although very faithful to their source material. Original forms of fairy tales being oral, then rewritten by the Grimm's brothers, as they were afraid that the stories would be forgotten. Grimm's fairy tales had the intention of frightening children, hoping to instill a fear of disobedience. Disney remediated these tales, hoping to inspire a sense of romanticism or fulfillment. With the remediation of The Wolf Among Us, the fairy tales involved seem to become a realistic fiction. The magic or nature of the characters is purely established by the viewer's pre-established knowledge. In reforming the stories as a game, it also makes the audience aware that the involved medium is a game, at times reminding the player of their involvement by giving command prompts. With the discovery of new media, new remediation occurs. In the case of games, this stems through the player involvement. Rules of play like win and loss states are things not attainable within the reaches of films and books. With the inclusion of games as a medium for storytelling, there has been a shift in the dynamic of how audiences experience stories, by adding levels of immediacy, or in other terms, having much more direct involvement or interactivity between the story being told and the person or persons who are playing through. The Wolf Among Us focuses on Bigby Wolf, or the Big Bad Wolf as he is more famously known, and follows his investigation of numerous murders in Fabletown. When a player plays this game, they see events happening directly to Bigby, which makes it difficult to put themselves in his shoes, as they can see it's not themselves, but Bigby this is happening to. There's no room to imagine that this is the player instead. By controlling Bigby, this allows audiences to experience the actions of the story through this intermediary character, which can allow the repercussions to be placed on the character, not the player. Others have examined how this vicariousness can affect gamers, and while it may make the morals of a story less directed at the player, it is still a great new alternative to storytelling that can have positive learning outcomes, and identify moral concepts. However, these same moral outcomes can still be warped when they are updated to a more modern context. Not just because of the remediation of the content, but because of a shift in awareness in the audience. Take Disney's two versions of Beauty and the Beast, for example. The 1991 animated film was about not judging a book by its cover. It even opens the story by giving exposition in a book. The new film is very similar. The trailer even matches shot for shot, as seen here. But the context can change with awareness. The house is full of animate, self-reliant appliances, like a house of smart devices. Now we can draw these conclusions and take a different meaning from the story, as we now have different context with which to examine the films. The benefit of remediating classic fairy tales is that there is transmedia storytelling occurring, meaning we don't have to redo an origin story 4 times over. I'm looking at you, Spider-Man. We can use content that has already been made and expand on it. Fables is a good example of this, and so is The Wolf Among Us. The game has a larger impact on audiences who are already aware of the fairy tales, as they are not merely meeting the characters for the first time, they are being reintroduced and now seeing them in a more expansive and flawed way. Yet this couldn't have been done without the previous renditions of such story, or at least not to the same degree. Wolf Among Us is different to many remediations in that it acknowledges the works it is based off. Most contemporary works repurpose old medium without openly referencing them, whereas this game openly acknowledges them to give the audience preconceived notions so it can twist them to surprise the audience. To wrap up, when attempting to reproduce an old story and express the same values for an updated audience, what those audience members learn and take away will be different. Remediation across medium can affect the moral intention of the story. As time passes, the context for our understanding changes, and although remediation allows for the retelling of traditional stories in new ways, audience response will always change in tandem with the global awareness of that time. Even the old films have different connotations for us now, with people being more aware of issues that were more pervasive but less considered, like technology, sexism, racism, or gender stereotypes. We can see now that what was a cautionary tale to be a better person could now be a reminder of how bad we were, which makes it a cautionary tale regardless.